Hey, what's up? It's Jesco again from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. Now, it's been a while since I uploaded a video. Two reasons really for that. One, after all the lockdowns dropped here in Germany, I kind of found it really important to get back in life and just enjoy life a little more. And so I kind of cut down on videos. And I'm also restructuring things a little on the backside because I want to make things a little fresh after like 3-4 years of doing this. Make it a bit more fun for me. So I'm kind of restructuring a few things, trying to get better and different content out there to you guys. And in that process, I'm probably not going to be making as many videos as I usually do. But one of the things that I've been wanting to do for a while, one of the things that's been on my mind for a while is answering some of the comments that you guys leave on my YouTube videos. If you followed me for a while, you've probably noticed that I'm not really involved or engaged in YouTube comments. And the simple reason is that I just don't really have time with like all the stuff that it takes to run a platform like Acoustics Insider. I quickly learned that I really have to focus on the few things that actually matter and prioritize my time there in order to keep things going. And so YouTube comments, unfortunately, isn't one of those things. But I do read the comments. I do try and take them into account as much as possible. And one of the things I thought would be fun would be to just go through some of the questions, give some love back to you guys commenting in my videos, and just do a kind of a quick lightning round Q&A session, taking some of the comments that you leave under my videos. And depending on how this goes and how much you guys like this type of content, I might do some more or some more regular sessions like this in the future. So this first one is by Uptown Photography. He's saying, I'm facing the decision whether to buy a 3-way 8-inch monitor or a 3-way 5-inch monitor, Kali Audio 5-inch versus 8-inch, for my home studio. I prefer to get the 8-inch versions, but I'm not sure if they will be too big for my control room. Good question, Philip. So there's another video that you should watch on my channel called Speaker Size versus Room Size, looking at the science. And the simple conclusion is that once you've figured out how much space you've got between your ideal listening position, your room, which is located at the room's low-end sweet spot, once you've figured out how much space you have to the front wall, you can then decide just how big, in terms of physical size, a speaker you can get to fit in that space and still have enough space between you and the speakers for the desk and everything else. In general, though, I would recommend getting the biggest speaker you can, considering those circumstances that I just described, because a bigger speaker will generally give you less distortion, more headroom, and obviously lower bass extension, okay? And most of these monitors still work fairly well in a near field scenario, so when you're quite close to the speaker, within or up to about 3 feet. And so in general, it's best to start aiming for big, and then only if the space doesn't permit physically to then shrink it down to what still fits within the space that you've got. I hope that answers your question. Moving on. So next question by Vikas Sheth, I guess. How to find the low-end sweet spot? Good question. And so the answer is that you download my PDF on the Bass Hunter technique, because that is a technique that I developed specifically to find your room's low-end sweet spot. It is the first step that you should take in any room when you're setting up a production setup, a mixing setup in a home studio. The first step before anything else is finding your room's low-end sweet spot, and you do that using the Bass Hunter technique, which is a simple listening test that shouldn't take you more than an hour to do, using just your speakers and your ears to optimize the listening position for an even low-end balance. And that's where you need to set up your listening position, and then you build everything up around that. All right. So again, it's a PDF that you can download. I'll leave a link in the description so you can get that as well. Hey, subwoofer question. This one's from the Ice Chamber Studio. He says, from my understanding, there's some benefit to placing a subwoofer at a potential null in your room, say a 50 Hz null, where the sub being placed there will effectively reduce the impact of the null on the listening environment, aka the room. If that is correct, would it not make sense to always want a subwoofer, preferably two? That way you can place the subs in the most beneficial spots for even bass response in a room, while also being able to place the monitors in the best spot for stereo imaging and phantom center. Am I totally incorrect on this? No, you're not totally incorrect on this, though I would question whether it is a good idea to aim for placing the subwoofer, one subwoofer, in a spot of a potential null of a standing wave, because obviously so basically what happens is the subwoofer can't then push energy into the room at that frequency, and so it's not just that it will effectively reduce the impact of the null. In fact, there won't be energy at all at the listening position at that frequency, which isn't what you want either, right? You don't want a super huge exaggeration of a certain frequency, but you don't want it to be canceled out completely either, right? In any case, there are lots of things to think about when talking about subwoofers, one or two, and how to place them. There's one thing you have to understand, you have to realize when you're working from a home studio, okay? Not a professional space for that purpose, but a home studio, a spare bedroom, an attic, a basement, whatever, perhaps asymmetrical, L-shaped or whatever, with windows and doors and like in awkward places and drywall and a suspended ceiling and all this stuff. The theory that allows you to work with a subwoofer, like you described, for example, carefully positioning it in a null or using two to cancel out certain energies, all that works in theory, and it also works in well-designed rooms. But as you go away, as you move away from these well-designed rooms, and I'm talking about the empty shell, right, the empty room, and you get impacts on the standing wave pattern that are asymmetrical, that aren't predictable or very difficult to figure out exactly how they work. All these things make it really difficult in practice to implement what you're saying. So it's not wrong in theory, it's just that it's very, very difficult to do it in practice. And some people might have more luck with it than others, and you might just find a spot and think, hey, this is all working out great. But if you really want to do it the scientific process, it takes careful measurements, and it can get very, very tricky to understand exactly what is going on, and then place the subwoofers in a way that you get this effect that you're describing, especially in an asymmetric room, in a room that has an asymmetric low-end response and doesn't respond as the theory suggests that you would need in order to make this work. Okay, so again, this is a difference between practice and theory. In theory, yes, implementable in practice, from possible to very difficult, depending on the kind of source material, the empty room that you're working with, right? So in practice, I would always recommend start with one subwoofer first, figure out how all these things that you need to or should optimize, that you can optimize in working with one subwoofer. So both placement, but also tying it into your speakers. So phase adjustment between the subwoofer and the speakers, how to use filters properly. Do you even have an option to do that? Is there an option to do time delay, time compensation, right? Volume, obviously, at what volume are you tying in this subwoofer? All these things I think you should get experience with and figure out before you step up to two subwoofers, which just makes the entire thing that much more complicated. And again, in practice, if you're working with bad source material, it can get very, very, very tricky, and you'll be running in circles in no time. Okay? So I hope that answers the question. Good question, though. So here's one from Jesus Vargas. So he says, I'm confused how a panel on a corner, I guess in a corner, across a corner, with an air gap can be as efficient as a panel that fills the entire corner, that fills the whole corner. So the thing to understand is that porous absorbers, these kind of bass traps that we're using, they work on a part of the sound wave, an attribute of the sound wave that's called sound velocity. We're not talking about the speed of sound. We're talking about a component and a variable that's described as sound velocity, and it describes the movement at which the individual air molecules vibrate and they move. And this pattern of vibration of the air molecules is inverse to sound pressure, which is how our ears work. We register sound pressure. but there are other things going on in a sound wave, including how these air molecules vibrate. And it's this vibration of the air molecules rubbing against the fibers in your absorbers that causes the energy to be switched over to heat, I guess, right, through friction, and thus kind of the sound wave is reduced. The energy in that sound wave is reduced. Now, the point is that the closer you get to the wall, the less sound velocity, movement of air molecules, you have in a sound wave, right? And the reason, or the way to think about this is, once you get basically all the way up to the wall, there's no more space for those air molecules to move. And so, ergo, the sound velocity has to drop to zero the closer you get to the wall, right? That's where this whole idea of the quarter wavelength rule comes along, okay? Or comes from. Now, as that sound velocity component drops as you get to the wall, there's basically no more energy in the sound wave for your porous absorber material to do any absorbing. And so the portion of the insulation material or the porous absorption material that is closest to the wall basically stops being useful. And you can literally just like get rid of it, basically, right? And so in that way, an air gap with some absorption in front of it almost works as well as just filling the entire thing with absorption material. Okay, so this is an approximation, or rather it's a cheat, if you will. Yeah, it doesn't work as well, but it does work well enough, and it saves you a whole lot of material. Okay, so it's a compromise. And when you're working on a budget, like in a home studio, and you want to save some money, this is one way you can do it. Yeah, so I hope that answers the question. So here's one from Arc Plays. I have a room 2 by 4 by 2.5 meters high with a round ceiling. Is it possible to use this as a home studio? Yes, it is. Absolutely. And it's just a matter of how much improvement can you actually get in there? How far can you take the improvement? And even a room in that size, you can do things. You can make the sound better if you kind of are aware of the compromises that you're getting yourself into, aka you're probably going to have to work in a very small stereo triangle because you want to be fairly close to the wall. You will have limited space to apply treatment, and that just means that you won't be able to control the room as much as if you had more space. But if all those things are things you are aware of, you can totally use it as your home studio. Okay, so here's one from Funker Vogt. And so he says, can you film a video about how to find the optimal point to place a work desk and monitors in a rectangular room? What do you think about the so-called 38% rule for that? That rule says that the optimal point, the listener position, to avoid standing waves is 38% from the length of the room and 38% from the width of the room. And next from this point, you place the monitors using classical triangle rule. Thanks in advance. All right, so interesting question. So let me clear up a few things here. The 38% rule is not a rule. It is a recommendation. It is a starting point, traditionally, to start looking for your for the optimal listener position. Now, why 38%? And we're talking, by the way, we're talking the length of the room at this point in a rectangular room where you're facing the short side. So the idea is to find a spot in the room where the room mode, the axial mode that happens between the front wall and the back wall has the right amount of energy, right? Right at the wall, you'll probably get a null for one frequency and a massive bass boost for a different frequency, depending on if you're talking about half a wavelength or a full wavelength fitting between those two walls. And as you move into the room, you'll get the kind of one starts increasing, the other frequency starts decreasing. You'll get to some optimal point where they balance out, where they both carry the right amount of energy, which is, by looking just purely at maths, at about 38% of the length of the room. And then you continue on and they start diverging again. So one will drop even more energy, the other one will increase even more energy, until you get to the middle of the room where it's once again worst, but swapped around. And then as you continue to the back of the room, the same thing happens. So this is purely theoretical, and it is about optimizing the amount of energy in the standing wave that happens between the front wall and the back wall. And if you look at the maths, that tends to happen at about 38% of the length of the room. So this is theory though, and we're only talking the length of the room. I'll talk about the width in a second. But the point is, once again, we usually don't live or work or set up in perfect rooms, right? If you're not working from a rectangular room, this entire idea goes out the window anyway, right? If there are asymmetries that break up the standing wave between the front and the back of the room, and that can be an angled wall, even slight angles, but it can also be awkwardly, it can be positions, window positions and door positions that change the resonant behavior of that axial mode. It can be drywall. There are a whole range of things that can affect standing waves and how they build up exactly in a room. So this only works in a rectangular room, and the more you diverge from that perfect rectangular room, the less this whole the less the theory works out, okay? So that's why I developed the base hunter technique, because with that technique, you can create a worst case scenario of the standing waves in your room and then use your hearing to find that same spot, which might not be at 38% of the length of the room. It might be somewhere else. It might be closer. It might be further away. If the room is asymmetrical, things are completely different, might be completely different anyway. But instead of just relying on theory that only works in a perfect room, we're using practice that also works in a real world room and any type of real world room, okay? So the base hunter technique is kind of a replacement for the 38% rule that we've traditionally tried to follow to find our listening position, except that now we're using we're looking at what's actually going on in the room and then basing our decision on that, okay? So now talking about the width of the room, yes, you can optimize the low end behavior by also moving left or right from the center axis of your room, but I don't actually recommend that. And the reason is that it'll really mess up your stereo image if you place your entire setup closer to one wall. And you can compensate for that, but in my opinion, it is a fairly big compromise, and it never ends up as good, or the benefit you get from sitting in the center of your room, even though you might be in the null of one of the room modes, the width mode, it's still more beneficial to then have a symmetrical, proper stereo image than just optimizing for that one standing wave, okay? So it's always a pick your poison situation with sound, right? So there's pros and cons to each attempt or each solution that you strive for, that you follow. And in this case, in my opinion, the priority should be your stereo image. And so you're sacrificing the potential right amount of energy when it comes to the width mode of your room. Good question. Okay, here's a simple one from Bharat J. What is the measurement mic that's used here? So I've been using the Behringer ECM 8000 for I don't know how long. It works perfectly well. I've tested it against many more expensive microphones, and it turned out to do exactly the same thing, both in amplitude and phase response. So that's totally fine. What I've noticed since are two things. When we're talking about measurement mics, especially cheaper measurement mics, it's not so much that they don't work, it's that they are inconsistent within the production line, right? So mine just tends to be great, but you might get one and you might find that the frequency response is totally off. And when we're talking totally off, we're talking usually a few dB somewhere in the mid or high range, okay? Maximum. Now, is this a problem? Not really. Because with what we're doing, we're looking at relative changes, right? Unless you're really trying to use a measurement to flatten out the frequency response for whatever reason, and that should be kind of the last decision, or the measurement is making the last decision for you. Then yes, you would probably want a calibrated microphone or a more high quality microphone. But we're only talking or looking at relative differences, and as long as you're using the same microphone for all the measurements that you're comparing, you'll still see the exact difference between those measurements as they are in the real world. So, and since those fine adjustments, like how much low end you have in your system or how much high end you have in your system, in my opinion, is a decision better made just using your ears it doesn't really matter that the microphone's frequency response is a little off. I personally just don't care. So I hope that gives you some perspective on like where the different qualities of microphones, measurement microphones sit and how to think about them. So here's one from DJ Victor Nova, and he's saying, I'm just wondering, when using EQ software to help the room sound flatter, when does it compromise the way your monitors sound? I would think that you're taking away from the monitors to help the room sound better on paper, now making the monitors not sound the way the manufacturer intended. I guess it's a balancing act to get the best of both worlds, room and monitor marriage. Okay, couple of different, I guess, questions in here, but so let's just start with EQ software, right? So there are many different products like that out there. Most of them, well, all of them, first of all, EQ or straighten out the frequency response, the amplitude frequency response, right? They're basically an EQ applied to the speakers. Some also do phase correction on top of that, but they tend to be a lot more expensive. So just talking about what all these pieces of software or these software tools do, which is speaker equalization, amplitude, frequency response, compensation. Basically, if you're just, well, first of all, of course, you're changing the sound in the way that the manufacturer is intended. But again, we're only talking about tonal balance. There are other things that also impact how a speaker sounds. With sound, we always have frequency and time to look at. And in many ways, time is a more important metric to look at. And obviously, if we're just EQing, we're not really changing the time aspect. Now, you might start saying, okay, but they're using filters with like some phase response. And yes, that's all happening. But in general, we're talking about frequency compensation and not really time compensation, right? We just have to live with what the filter does in terms of time. So we're changing the sound of the speaker, yeah, but not all monitors are that perfect anyway in the first place, okay? So I wouldn't worry about that too much. Remember that the goal is to get a sound, a system that you can trust, that better lets you work more intuitively, and most importantly, that when you make decisions on whatever it is, delay, EQ, compression, or space in general, panning, whatever it is, that volume, that all those changes equally happen when you take the mix outside the room, so that you can rely on the changes you're making being represented in the same way wherever you take that mix, that piece of sound, right? So mix translation, obviously, yeah. And in practice, the compromise you're making when you're EQing your speakers is usually only in terms of when you're boosting with that EQ. Because what happens at that point is that you're asking the speaker to play a particular frequency with a much higher volume. And you just have to remember that a 6 dB boost in volume and energy from your speakers is a doubling of power. So just by adding a 6 dB boost with an EQ, you're asking your speaker to output twice the amount of power at that particular frequency. And that can quickly lead to the speaker distorting at that frequency because it doesn't have enough power available to do so. Okay, that's what we call reducing headroom. We're reducing the amount of available power that the speaker can use up, gobble up, when it needs to play really loud sounds, basically. Okay, we're never working at our speaker's maximum potential kind of power output. We're always working below that, so we have some reserve left for the sound to play with, right? And if you're now boosting somewhere with an EQ on the speaker side, you're suddenly robbing it, or potentially robbing it, of a lot of its available power, which means, again, the sound distorts. So you have two options: either you live with the distortion and potentially even break your speaker, or you reduce the volume to once again have that headroom, that buffer of available power available to you. Okay, so that's the main compromise that you're making when you're EQing your speakers. There are several other ones depending on how strong the EQ is, how much you're EQing. You're obviously statically changing the frequency response of the speaker, and that will be the same no matter where you are in the room. So certain parts of your room might sound worse which is not great. There's also a calculation delay involved often, right? So the calculating that EQ takes some time, which delays your speakers and might not be acceptable to you, depending on how tight your restrictions are for the latency of your system. Okay, so yes, EQ has compromises, but it also has large benefits, and that's why we want to minimize how much EQ we employ, how strong the EQ is, which in turn means we want to do as much as we can with treatment and then only apply the EQ, so it has to do as little as possible. In an ideal world, obviously, we don't want to use EQ at all, but in most cases for home studios, this tool, equalization, is available and beneficial, and so why not use it? So here's an interesting one from Chris Gazel. He said he just saw a video of a big name acoustics panel company stating that it's recommended for small rooms to put the speakers right up against the front wall to avoid phase cancellations, and that if not enough room, putting your speakers 4 feet or more away from the wall would be best, since the phase cancellation from the front wall reflections would be at very low frequencies by that. Would love to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah, good question. I haven't talked about this for a while now, but I wrote an extensive article on this exact topic for Sonic Scoop, and it's called something like the #1 thing you shouldn't trust in your speaker manual or something like that. I'll link it down below as well. And the point is, yes, this is totally correct. What we're talking about here in specific terms is speaker boundary interference, right? So this is when the sound from the speaker hits an adjacent surface, gets reflected back, and interferes at the speaker membrane, causing a comb filter that is basically imprinted onto the frequency response of the speaker. Funny thing, that never gets mentioned for some reason, but apparently, I don't know this, I haven't tested it yet, but the textbooks say you can actually measure the effect of the speaker bound interference by measuring the frequency dependent power consumption of the speaker, right? Because obviously, if a comb filter is imprinted onto the speaker response, at certain frequencies, the speaker will pull less power, and this is something you can actually measure. In any case, the point is that, yes, in order to reduce the effect of speaker bound interference, in order to move it up in frequency or move it down in frequency, so that in both cases, in either case, it stops being a problem, you either have to get really close to the wall, which is why in most small rooms it makes sense to set up your speakers as close to the wall as possible, or you have to set up your speakers fairly far away. And 4 feet is not enough, in my opinion. This should really be more, and you can check out the article that I wrote in order for like actual detailed numbers. But the point is, you need to get a fair amount of distance between you and the speaker and the offending surface for this to work. And again, what most people don't mention when they talk about speaker boundary interference, and most speaker manufacturers don't mention, is that this doesn't just involve the wall behind the speakers. This involves potentially all surfaces in your room. You need to ideally move away at least 4 feet from all surfaces in your room, not just the wall behind the speakers, but the left or right wall, the floor, the ceiling, the back wall, whatever, right? Because you get this effect from any offending surface or any surface that can reflect sound back to the speaker and is big enough to cause a proper reflection. So it's not just a question of the back wall, it's a question of all the walls. And this in practice means that if you want to implement this advice, you quickly start turning in circles, because it becomes really, really difficult to optimize your speaker placement considering only speaker boundary interference and in relation to all walls. Basically, you just end up in an endless vicious cycle of just placing and replacing and measuring and just going nuts at some point. The thing is, this is a problem that you can, to some extent, fairly easily reduce with acoustic treatment. And none of this thinking respects that the speaker placement is crucial to get a proper soundstage, a proper phantom center, a proper stereo image from your speakers. Just because you found the perfect spot in terms of speaker boundary interference for your speakers does not mean you're going to get a proper stereo image. And the stereo image is way more important than potentially having a notch in your frequency response because of speaker boundary interference. Okay? Plus, you can actually reduce the impact of speaker boundary interference with treatment later on. But you cannot somehow fix the stereo image with treatment if your speakers are set up badly. Okay? So, in my opinion, we're prioritizing stereo image when we set up our speakers. We're just going to ignore speaker boundary interference for now, because once we've figured out how we need to set up our speakers to get a proper stereo image, we can either look at treatment to reduce speaker boundary interference, or we can start moving back the speakers towards the wall behind the speakers and at least reduce the impact of that surface while double checking that our stereo image doesn't fall apart. And if it does, we just have to stop and just live with the compromises, or with the compromise, okay? So long story short, in theory, totally true. In practice, poor advice, because you should be focusing on something else that is more important, aka the stereo image. And if you follow my channel for any time period, you know that I do that by ear using what I call the phantom speaker test. It's again something that you can download for free when you sign up to my email list. I'll also put a link to that in the description. Good question. Okay, with that, I'm going to wrap up this Q&A. I think we had some really good questions in there. Let me know if you like this style of video, if you get something from it, and I'll make sure to do it in the future. One other thing. If you are currently in the process of treating your studio, maybe you've already done some treatment, you're kind of messing around with certain things, you're looking at different options, and you're not entirely sure kind of what the next step is that you should be taking, or what you should be focusing your energy on as you're going through this process of treating your room, I want you to download my home studio treatment framework, which is linked in the description. It's basically an overview of the 5 main steps in order, in the right sequence that I recommend you take them, in order to be smart about your treatment, in order to be smart about how you approach getting the most out of your room and speakers. It's a fairly simple PDF you can download, and it just walks you through all those different things. It looks at all the different aspects that come into play when you're setting up a new studio. So obviously, setting up your listening position, setting up your speakers, but also speaker decoupling, measurements, different types of treatment, when you should look at them, diffusion, obviously, subwoofers, they're all in there, and it basically tells you what to focus on and why and how to think about each of those steps, and when you need to do them, when the right time has come for you to do them, in order not to start spinning in circles and having to redo stuff because maybe you forgot something in advance. All right. So again, if you're treating your room, if you want to figure out, if you want to know how I approach treating a room, and you want to figure out what the right steps are that you should be taking, download my home studio treatment framework at the link in the description. Okay, that's it for now. See you in the next one.